Hello, everybody, and welcome to the USFL Show Week 2. I'm going to be your host for today, Sean, PSU Fans 2 Newsham. Joining me, one of my good friends, niche sports legend, Alex Hardin, Fearmyturtle. Alex, how you doing today?
Doing good, Sean. Ready for Week 2?
I didn't get to experience Week 1 because I was on vacation. So, you got to experience Week 1. So I guess we'll start out. Let's start out talking about Week 1. For the viewers that maybe missed Week 1, for myself who maybe missed most of Week 1 due to traveling, what is the good, the bad, and the ugly from Week 1? So let's start with the good. What was some of the good things that you saw from Week 1?
I mean, there really wasn't much in the good category. I would say the product on the field wasn't that bad. I mean, low expectations, so the bar was low. But, I mean, it could be interesting. I mean, would I watch these games if I wasn't playing DFS and gambling on them? Probably not. But, hey, that's what it's here for, spring football, right?
Yeah.
The bad execution on DK side was a little shaky. Got a free roll. Actually, I guess the free roll for the main slate falls in the good category. But, yeah, a lot of mishaps, a lot of questions, a lot of scoring errors, giving out free tickets to fill contests. It was just quite an adventure for Week 1. In terms of actual DFS, I think I kind of fundamentally approached the slate wrong. I think undervalued the running backs just because of the lack of depth and the quality of offensive line play led to a lot of dump offs and peppering the slot and running the ball a lot. So yeah, that was definitely too high on a lot of the outside receivers. But we'll see where it takes us in Week 2. Don't want to overreact.
And for me, I think some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the bad, the coaches. I think the coaches are just horrendous. We'll talk about some of them as we go. We saw the one coach cut Devion Smith for wanting a pizza because he doesn't like chicken salad. And that was just the prototypical, I'm a moron, power hungry, I'm going to make an example out of someone move. And it was just kind of disgusting to watch. And honestly, it was uncomfortable to watch. He basically, if people haven't seen, go watch the video of it. Devion Smith was trying to explain what happened and it seemed pretty logical. And the coach was just like, it doesn't matter. You're cut. And it was just uncomfortable to watch, knowing that, especially for these type of players, these are some of their last chances. No one's really going to get much of a chance after this. So watching them just cut someone because he wanted food that he actually likes was pretty uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, the best part is him coming out their first game, their first series. They have 8 offensive linemen, no receivers, and just run the ball into the guard 3 straight times and punt. And he's on the sideline clapping his hands. It was just a great follow up to the whole Devion Smith debacle.
It is. And that's one of the things Alex and I talked about before the show. Just as we were discussing the league in general, we don't understand why these leagues aren't getting young coaches that are exciting, that make things happen, that sort of will play a appealing brand. They literally get the most dull coaches that are clearly inept and very bad at their jobs, and watching them over and over again in these type of leagues is painful. You see them enough in the NFL and college ranks that you see them in this type of stuff. You see a guy come out, the one team ran the ball 24 consecutive plays. That is just not conducive to be exciting and wanting people to watch. So those are just some of the overviews from Week 1. So you talked about sort of how you approach the slate and how it was probably suboptimal and how you've learned a bit more from how the league is, and especially compared to the XFL. The XFL's rule sets really led to passing and was much more appealing from a passing player perspective, whereas the USFL appeared more running based. And especially with the lack of depth on teams at running back and receivers, it seemed like a lot more of the running back especially were sort of bumped up. So how did you approach it from Week 1 compared to how you're sort of looking at it now?
Yeah, just I took too much of the XFL bias into here where the running backs in the XFL really struggled to produce. However, I think they had a bit more depth with the rosters in the USFL only being 38 active and 7 practice squad. But most of these teams are rolling into the game with only 2 active running backs. And I mean, it leads to a situation where they're going to get solid carries. And then obviously a lot of the pass games are just a lot of dink and dunk stuff. So if a running back is getting 15 carries and 5 targets, it's really hard for them to lose out to a receiver who's in a 5 to 7 man rotation. So I definitely overvalued like the big outside receivers, thinking that they had like slate breaking upside, which I think they do. It's just last week wasn't the week to go heavy on them and playing them into such high ownership, whereas a lot of the running backs were a bit under-owned. And just if you're going into lineups with 4 wide receivers last week, you're going to get slaughtered, just on how it played out. But I think the people who approached it running back heavy got rewarded a bit for playing it the correct way. And I don't think week 2 is going to be that much different in terms of who we're looking at. There's a lot of really solid running back options.
Yeah, so we'll go through each position sort of is how we're going to go through this today, and then we'll talk about different constructions. For those watching, we are filming this on Wednesday morning. We're trying to figure out the best time to record stuff based on when practice squad information is going to get released, if it's going to get released, what we'll have later in the week compared to early in the week. So if you see a bunch of news that comes out Thursday and Friday night and you watch this, it might be different than what we would have said at that time. We are hopeful that stuff is going to be relatively stagnant from who's going to be in and out based on the practice squad. But this is a work in progress for us, just like the league is. And we're going to try to do things that make the best sense for us from a timing perspective and from the league from how they announce their info. So
a problem with that one issue is like the games are being played like this week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So if you're playing games over a 3-day period, you're going to get news in like a cycle throughout the week and not all in once if you were planning for like an NFL Sunday type slate. So like we see practice reports for the Friday game come out 2 nights ago, the initial practice reports for the Saturday games coming out yesterday, and then tonight we'll probably get the practice reports for the Sunday game. So it's going to be a situation where you need to kind of monitor it throughout and understand that there'll be roster moves up until like 30 minutes before the game. So we'll be on top of that from a projection perspective, but it's definitely a rolling lock type of sport throughout the weekend.
Yeah, and make sure you guys are in the Discords. We'll be posting updates in the Discord. As Alex said, the projections get updated whenever we see a piece of news that alters things, and it gets just updated frequently as the week goes. So make sure you are up to date with that. So, all right, we're going to go position by position, sort of talk through what we're thinking from a maybe optimal standpoint and then maybe a GPP standpoint as well. So the first thing that I noticed in terms of quarterback play is there is a heavy rotation in the league. About half the teams are rotating between 2 quarterbacks to some extent or another. The exception being, I think that we were waiting on J'Mar Smith versus Magoo, and Magoo did not practice, so we're expecting him to be out as of now, which would give J'Mar Smith the full workload for Birmingham. So the first thing that you look at when you look at the quarterback, you see a few guys that are quite low in terms of projections. And that's because like Paxton Lynch and Shea Patterson were rotating to some extent in week 1. DeAndre Johnson and Luis Perez, it seems like they're clearly going to have Perez as the pass down quarterback and then Johnson as the rushing quarterback. And it really is going to depend on game flow, sort of how that works. But looking at them, both of them performed their role really well in week 1. So it's hard to sort of see them altering that. Like I would expect it to be very similar. And then like Pittsburgh, everyone was expecting Lauletta to be the quarterback. And then boom, Josh Love starts on Sunday. So hopefully we get rid of some of that nonsense. But what's your thoughts on the quarterbacks, Alex, with what you saw week 1 going into week 2?
Yeah, I think it's fairly clear cut in terms of like the top half that are playable, and then like the bottom half, which is it's going to be kind of tough to use. We'll say out of the bottom half in terms of projections, someone like DeAndre Johnson obviously has more upside just because it's clear that he's going to be doing a lot of running. And it's a situation where if he's getting 10 to 15 carries a game, he can certainly win out and be the top scoring quarterback on the slate just on through the ground. So he'd be somebody that I'd be more interested in tournaments near the bottom end. Whereas if you look at somebody like Josh Love and Luis Perez, you really struggle to see kind of like the slate breaking upside if they're just going to be dropping back and throwing 15 to 20 passes in that game. So while the projections are within a point, I view DeAndre Johnson a lot differently than like Perez and Love. And really, I probably won't play much. I won't play any Lynch. He'll probably get a few snaps, but they'll probably be more like run specific plays and not getting like complete series like DeAndre Johnson could.
Yeah, and for me, it's even less appealing. Like I'm not even that interested in playing Shea Patterson. If Paxton Lynch is going to get some goal line and rush packages and plays 25% of the snaps, that's enough to sort of get me away from that as well. So in terms of optimal, like you and I were talking before we came on, for us, Brian Scott's the clear best quarterback from an optimal perspective. And the reason for that is that Philadelphia is the team that is intent on passing. So we talked about this in the XFL when the XFL was going on with PJ Walker and how Houston played. They threw the ball, which therefore meant that he was at least sort of, he had a built-in floor that, like, this guy is going to pass. Where some of these other teams just are intent on running the ball. If you're going to run the ball 20 straight plays, it makes it very difficult for a quarterback to really be productive in that aspect. So talk a little bit about Brian Scott and why we think he's sort of the optimal quarterback.
Yeah, so the pass rates were really down week 1, except for Philadelphia and Birmingham. At Philadelphia, around like 63% pass. And I think that's kind of what they wanted to do and kind of what we expected coming into the league. They wanted this basically Brian Scott's offense to run. It's going to get a lot of dropbacks. So from a volume perspective, he's the clear one. Jamar Smith, we have 2 right now. They were fairly pass heavy week 1, but that was likely due to the game script. So as we kind of work through our team baseline projections, we might see him come down a bit. I'm not as comfortable in him getting the pass volume as would say like a Brian Scott. And then like Jordan Ta'amu is more of a wild card. We didn't see him run much at all. He only had 1 carry last week, and we were kind of banking on his rushing floor being something this year. If they're not going to use him like St. Louis did last year in the XFL, Ta'amu is just going to be more of like an upside type play in situations where he's forced to run. Maybe this game versus New Orleans, New Orleans gets out ahead and they kind of have to run Ta'amu more. I'd be certainly interested in his upside. However, I'm not confident in him being able to beat like a Brian Scott just if he's going to be a dropback quarterback.
Yeah, and part of the thing with Scott too is like half of these teams, as we talked about, they have question marks at quarterback. They're going to rotate quarterback. It's Brian Scott. Like Brian Scott's the quarterback, it seems. He's going to be the guy. He's going to throw the ball. He's the one quarterback that for sure will be active in the game because of how that team wants to play. That's why we're doing it. So from a GPP perspective and upside perspective, to me, it's pretty obvious that DeAndre Johnson has the biggest upside. But he could be completely phased out of the game as well, depending on how the script sort of needs to go. But when you see a guy that rushes for 98 yards and a touchdown at quarterback when no other quarterback on the slate even matched, I don't believe, the points he put up just on the ground on his 12 carries, it makes him pretty appealing. So what's your thoughts on DeAndre Johnson and the GPP side of things?
Yeah, I'll play some of him. I'll probably pass on Perez and just play the Johnson side of that. And it's interesting because I don't know what the best game script for him is, DeAndre Johnson. If they're up, maybe they just keep Perez in and just hand off to the running backs. If they're behind, maybe they like DeAndre Johnson's playmaking ability. I just think it's tough to kind of see how that's going to play out in any kind of game script that turns out. We saw them get interchanged throughout drives many times, and I think that'll probably be the case here. But certainly on DeAndre Johnson is the upside guy. You could see him break off a long run for sure.
Yeah. All right. So now moving over to running back. So you and I talked, and actually, so for those watching, I didn't watch week 1 and I didn't prepare for week 1 as much because I knew I was unavailable. And I gave Alex like a breakdown of like after watching, sort of looking through some things, reading some things, checking out snap counts, stuff like that. I gave like a breakdown of like what I thought the plays were that Alex would like and who he would have as top play. Pretty much running back, receiver, quarterback. I was like spot on with Alex's top 5 in each group with what he liked. But so looking at the running backs, the running back target share was incredibly high for a lot of teams. Like a lot of receivers were getting like 4 to 6 targets, which is really fantastic as a floor for some of those running backs. And there's even more stuff that we'll need to be looked at this week. You're going to need to follow the practice squad stuff. Most of these teams had guys that were out and on the practice squad that they could rotate between. And the biggest piece of news that we have right now is for New Jersey, they just cut Mike Weber. So that locks in sort of Trey Williams as one of the better running backs on the slate. And then Matt Colburn for Philadelphia did not practice on Tuesday. So if Colburn were to miss, we would expect for Darnell Holland to sort of step up in that role and get a bit more of a workload, and they would probably activate Paul Terry. Now, the thing is, too, with Colburn versus Darnell Holland, for those that are not familiar with Matt Colburn, the nickname we have for him is Fat Colburn because he is a large man that does not have much skill. Whereas like Darnell Holland ran a 4.38 40 and actually has some explosiveness. So I think that like when you're looking at those two, you'll see them very evenly projected. And Colburn is projected for more due to a better workload in week 1. But if he's out, you have a guy like Holland be a elite level play. But so what's your thoughts on like the top end running backs and break those down for us?
Yeah, so just on the Philadelphia thing, I think if Colburn were to miss, which I don't necessarily think he will, it's still early. We need to monitor practice reports throughout the week. But Paul Terry is someone who's played with this group of guys before, and I think he would step in to most of the Colburn role. It would help Holland probably a little bit, but Holland's definitely like your upside guy. Yeah, in terms of the top 3, Trey Williams, Logan, and Emmons, I think that's pretty much tier 1. They separate themselves a little bit from a workload perspective. Like it's just tough to beat like the 15 carry 5 target type role that Williams, Logan, and maybe even Emmons has. Emmons, I'm still a little bit questionable on his pass game involvement, but he did have 3 targets week 1, and it's clear that he's going to get a lot of the early down volume in terms of rushing attempts. So and you look at the price tags, they weren't fully adjusted. We saw TJ Logan at like 3.3 last week. He's up at 6.4, but he really should be more. Same with Trey Williams, definitely should be in like the 7K range. Emmons appropriately priced at 8.5. So you might see a bit less ownership on him. Yeah, but I mean, we don't want to overvalue or what we saw in week 1. There's guys in the second tier that can certainly win out, and someone like Jordan Ellis, I think to me is a kind of a premier GPP pivot on this slate. Someone who got a lot of volume, he just didn't get the touchdown. Is not going to have as much volume through the air. However, like he's certainly someone that can beat Logan. You'll probably get him at 3 or 4 times less ownership at least.
Yeah, and that was something. So when we looked through, you and I were talking about snap counts. We were talking about market shares, rush shares, target shares, and we're just talking about in general, everything was pretty even. Every team pretty much had 2 running backs, and they all pretty much used those 2 running backs in at worst like a 60-40 scenario. There was like one exception, I think, that Trey Williams had like 65-35 scenario. So like he was clearly a little bit ahead of things. But what Alex is just talking about, like there's no clear workhorses in the league, at least as of yet. And everybody's pretty even. So like when you look at the situation Alex just talked about, like we like TJ Logan. Both Alex and I think he's probably a top 3 raw points running back on the slate. But Jordan Ellis had a very, very similar workload to TJ Logan, and you're probably going to get him at 5x lower ownership. Well, if you're getting him at 5x lower ownership and you're going to expect them to have within probably 2 to 3 touches of each other, Ellis is not going to lose to Logan 90% of the time, 80% of the time. Like it's going to be like 60-40 type results as well. So it's a great GPP pivot, like Alex said. So in terms of other running backs, like we talked about, you and I think that people are going to be down a bit on Garrett Groshek because they just didn't really throw the ball. Their offense is kind of terrible. And also also Madre London. Like, look, these are not the most talented running backs, which granted, most of the people in the league are not going to be, but they are intent on running the ball. And we talked about, do you think that Groshek and or London are just going to get a volume game at some point where they just get touchdowns, they get volume because the run game is actually working for them that game?
Yeah, certainly. However, I was expecting more of a pass game involvement from Groshek, and that really didn't happen. They were looking more at their fullback, Mikey Daniel, out of the backfield more than him or London. But I think in a game where it goes according to plan for Pittsburgh, Groshek and or London could have 20 carries and certainly a touchdown or 2. So I think they're both in play. can't play everybody in my GBB pool, so it's probably a situation where I'll pick one of the two of Groshek and London and be a bit heavy on them. But they certainly could win out on the slate, and we know Pittsburgh wants to run. They want to feed them. Groshek probably gets the ball if they're on in goal line. So that's definitely an interesting one. Another one is the Birmingham situation. We all expected Tony Brooks-James to be the lead back. He only played 35% of the snaps week 1. CJ Maribel played 65%. He's a bit more dynamic, I think. The situation where you have somebody that has a clear workload advantage at a cheaper price tag, he might get overlooked a bit on the slate, CJ Maribel. So I think he's a pretty good tournament look as well.
Yeah, and I think one other note was I believe Dalen Dawkins did not practice, or Mark Thompson did not practice. If Mark Thompson were missed, it would probably be a nice bump for Dalen Dawkins. But yeah, in GPPs, I think you can play a lot of these guys because, like, realistically speaking, I could see Jordan Ellis smashing. I could see him having the best of the running back games for them. I could see Tony Brooks-James having the better running back game for them. I could see even different players like on a lot of these teams having better results. Like you could see Colburn and Holland, we might project them evenly, but if Colburn's misses and maybe they have to bring someone else up and Holland maybe gets a increase of, let's say, 10% to his load, all of a sudden he's probably the best player on the slate. So I just think there's a lot of different paths. And as you see, the top end of the running back is 15. You go down like 15 guys, you're still looking at it being around 8 points. So like, there's still a reasonable projection for a lot of these guys. All right, on to the receivers. So why don't you talk a little bit first about how the slot receivers were very apparent in week 1 and sort of like what their results were.
Yeah, you could see a common theme throughout the league was it was tough to get the ball to the outside receivers. You could probably blame this on a lot of things, but like the offensive line play, obviously not great. The outside receivers had some issues separating. And really, I mean, if your offensive line is struggling a bit, snap the ball, your first look is going to be kind of over the middle. So we saw a lot of slot guys, tight ends, and running back dump offs. And so that shouldn't be overly surprising. And that probably continues here. So I'm going to definitely be playing some of the outside receivers, but probably not in my cash lineup, generally speaking. But I still think there's some of them that could break some slates this year for sure. So like starting off top, we have Victor Bolden as the highest projected. I think he ran a little bit bad last week. He still had like a 27% target share, I believe. Solid performance, just didn't get in the end zone. I think it's a situation where he's definitely one of the safer wide receivers. I believe he played 100% of snaps.
He did.
And running out of the slot in this offense, I think he's certainly going to be pretty reliable week to week. You look at someone like his other teammates, Cyrus Mitchell playing out wide right. He's going to be kind of their air yards, high variance receiver. He had a good week 1. Marlon Williams, our boy from UCF, playing out wide left. He doesn't I mean, I'm not expecting big things for him playing out wide. And you saw it in week 1. He had 5 targets, but no catches. He didn't look great. He looked big and slow to me. He played a lot of slot in college and he just got fed. Here's a different story. He's only 3K, so obviously playable still, but he was a bit disappointing week 1. What do you think about the Birmingham receivers and who are you looking towards after Bolden?
Yeah, so the key for me is, so if you look through teams, like there's some teams that just heavily rotate and their receivers are sort of like a dumpster fire. So like Michigan heavily rotated receiver, Tampa Bay heavily rotated at receiver, with the exception of Alex's boy, Cheyenne O'Grady. I was in traveling back from my vacation. I was just getting message after message from Alex about like Cheyenne O'Grady just getting force fed the ball for Tampa Bay. So anyways, like you have a few teams like Philadelphia, I really like their receivers. And we'll talk about it a little bit in a minute. The outside guys a bit more, but the slot guys, like I really like what we saw with Rowland. I really like what we saw with Devin Gray, but again, their snap counts weren't great. The reason why I really like Birmingham receivers is when you look at them, Victor Bolden played 100% of the snaps. Cyrus Mitchell played 96. Marlon Williams played 100%, and Kerry Angeline played 89%. These guys did not come off the field. It was those 4 guys at all times getting the market share. Like, I think that's very appealing when you look at them. You had 8, 5, 7, and 6 targets. So they all average 6.5 targets a game as a 4. There was no one else to get any volume out of them. So I think that's pretty appealing when you look at stuff compared to some of these other teams. But something Alex noted that I think we will need to discuss on is a lot of stuff went through the slot. When you look at a lot of the productive receivers in week 1, you look at like Bolden, you look at Rowland, you look at some of these other guys, a lot of the production came out of the slot. The people that are going to break slates this year that are really going to explode and blow things up are guys like Jordan Sewell. So Jordan Sewell is on Philadelphia, and he is 6'6", and he basically was just running wind sprints in week 1. And he was very unproductive. He had 3 targets and didn't really produce. However,
yeah, one of those targets was like a 50-yard jump ball that he almost came down with. So yeah, it looked like a little bit different. But yeah,
the way that I think that this league is going to work with the outside receivers is like we're going to look at like Sewell, we're going to look at like a Cyrus Mitchell, we're going to look at like Bailey Gaither, guys like this that are going to be on the outside. They're going to get their chances, and 1 or 2 weeks a year, they're going to catch a 50-yard touchdown, then maybe another 50-yard touchdown. And we saw week 1, scoring's not going to be huge. If you catch like a 60-yard touchdown, you're going to have a good game. So we're going to see these guys be very, very GPP heavy. So like Sewell was really unproductive week 1. You see he's 7K. People aren't really going to play Sewell. They're going to play people that were better than him for cheaper. They're going to play people that were better than him that were more expensive. And people are just not going to play guys like that. The person we'll talk about is Poindexter. So Sean Poindexter was not productive in week 1. And I'm not saying he's going to be productive in week 2, but he was the most expensive receiver, most high-owned receiver, and did nothing. However, he played a good majority of the game. At some point, he's going to be productive and probably catch a bomb or 2. And then the one other note sort of at receiver here is that you'll see Randy Satterfield. He's not projecting that well for us. We think that he sort of ran really well in week 1. They did not throw the ball tons. His snap count was not the best. His target share was not huge. He only had 5 targets, just ran like the sun sort of to get there. So guys like that are going to be really high owned because of what their production was, and they might not be the best plays overall. So what's your thoughts on like a guy like Satterfield, Alex?
I think Satterfield's okay. He did play like 90% of the snaps, but he caught all 5 of his targets. And the thing with their wide receiver core is pretty banged up. So it's a situation where they have like 2 of their guys out and other 2 are limited. He might be a better play than we initially thought this week. We'll have to kind of see how that plays out. However, I don't trust this team to be pass happy at all. They're fine running the ball, and I mean 24 straight rushes. It's kind of incredible. Yeah, Satterfield ran really well. He's a fine play, but likely to be overowned. So I definitely agree with that. I will say like the difference between like a Poindexter and a Jordan Sewell is Poindexter only was on 52% of the snaps and got no targets, whereas Sewell played like over 90% of the snaps and got 3 targets. So I think there's a clear difference there. If they're going to be anywhere near the same ownership this week, I would definitely prefer to play the Sewell side. But Poindexter is a big guy. He'll probably have some productive games. It's just going to be really volatile with him.
Yeah, and there's other guys in the league that also saw limited snaps, but had some sort of high upside that had chances to blow things out. So like it's not just limited to that. You're generally going to be looking at outside receivers for that. Quickly, we'll talk about defense, and then we'll move on to a couple other things before we wrap up. Defense, the Stars are the biggest favorites on the slate. They are the cheapest defense on the slate. Expect them to be incredibly chalky. I would probably in GPP look to go elsewhere because it's going to be a variance fest, and I think they're going to be tremendously high owned due to their price. But we don't need to talk anything else really about the defense because I think you're pretty much on board with that thought, right, Alex?
Yeah, the only thing to add on defense really is I would say spread around your exposure. And like the Stars specifically, they're playing against a team that's going to be run heavy. You generate a lot of defensive points through interceptions and sacks. So you do want to play a team that has a lot of dropbacks. I think we'll probably see kind of Pittsburgh forced to throw some, so the Stars are certainly viable, but they'll be overowned for sure. So I would say spread it around, and we don't have a ton of sample in terms of defensive stats to understand like sack rates by team. So there's still a lot of constants being used for these defensive projections. So I would say just spread it around. Yeah.
Yep, I agree with that. All right, so talking about roster construction a little bit here. Talk about how you view like the optimal and like how you view what would be an optimal construction setup for like cash games.
Yeah, so for this week, it's probably going to be 3 running backs. So you're playing a running back and then in both of the flex positions. So if we take someone like a Brian Scott to start out with, 9,600, I think that's going to be a pretty common starting point for a cash game construction. And then it's kind of going to be pick your favorite 3 running backs and then figure out wide receiver after that, I would say. So like if we're looking at like a Trey Williams and a Logan and Emmons, like you still have 6,700 average to fill out. And so like if you go to defense and plug in the Stars, which I think will be like the chalk, like then you have a 7,400 receiver to pick whoever you want really. So I mean, I think something along this line is going to be a pretty common cash game construction. I could see people with salary left over and they're just move from Scott to Tamu just because he cost more and there's a perceived higher upside with that. So it wouldn't be shocking if Scott wasn't the highest owned quarterback. Obviously, I think we're probably one of the first to have our projections out for week 2. So we'll see where everyone else is at there. That'll certainly influence ownership. But the quarterback pool is going to be pretty tight for cash games. And I think there's probably a 4 to 5 running back group that people will pick 3 from. So with all of this said, if you're looking to differentiate in tournaments a bit, you could cap your running backs a bit or be kind of aware of how many you're playing, especially if their ownership gets a bit out of control. So say like a Trey Williams, Logan, and Emmons, or if they each end up being over like 40% owned, maybe you only want to play 2 of those 3 together or 1 of those 3 in large field tournaments. So there's definitely some things to consider once we get a better feel for ownership.
Yeah, and I think so for me this week, like Alex said, you might want to, I probably would be playing 3 running backs in my lineups. I'm not positive on that, but I think that's the way I'm leaning currently. And then I think you can differentiate enough at receiver that you don't need to differentiate at running back as much. Like Alex said, but I'm still interested in getting people like Groshek. I'm interested in getting people like Jordan Ellis. Like I'm still interested in players like that. So like I'm gonna have guys that are maybe low owned. So like a good way to do it is like Alex said, maybe I will have Trey Williams, TJ Logan, Emmons, Colburn, and Darnell Holland and limit myself to 2 of them. And then also I could limit myself to 1 of Colburn and Holland. Obviously, I probably don't want both. So like realistically speaking, you can limit yourself to 2 of the 4 within that group. And then maybe play another running back outside of that group. But realistically, a receiver, I think that's where you do your differentiation. I could totally see someone like, for example, we'll talk about quickly, Chris Rowland in week 1 was really productive. However, Devin Gray played more snaps than him in the slot for Philly, despite having worse target share. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to mirror what we look at for the season. So like Devin Gray, for example, could be better than him. Or like looking down some of these other guys, like we talked about Sewell, like Sewell could totally catch a bomb and end up having a huge game compared to these other guys. And if Sewell ends up going out and producing a 70-yard touchdown and maybe like 3 for 101, having a guy like Sewell would make a lot more sense. So I think you can differentiate a lot more at receiver because there's just a lot of people, like, for example, like Sal Cannella. Sal Cannella had like 7 or 8 targets in week 1, and he's 5,200. His projection's not going to be popping anywhere, I wouldn't imagine. And he's a guy that could be sort of involved heavily within that offense. So that's sort of how I would differentiate. Is that how you would go about your differentiation for this week?
Yes, certainly. And I think there's so many for like a 4-game slate. There's a lot of plays still to be had, a lot of combinations. I will say in terms of like stacks, I'm interested in doing some like quarterback, running back, receiver stacks, either 3 or 4 man, just kind of onslaught team. We've seen there's the running backs be involved in the passing game enough where I think that definitely makes sense. And if a passing game can't support, like, say, like 2 outside receivers, just kind of mixing it up a bit with the running backs and slot receivers, I think, to me, makes a lot of sense. But yeah, just trying to go through the process of not like over accounting for week 1. And just still understand there's still going to be a lot of variance in this league, especially with the teams that are rotating like 5 receivers. I think we have a few teams penned down that we can rely on for a pretty concise kind of rotation, but there's still going to be a lot of guys that can pop off at like sub 10% ownership for sure.
Definitely, which is what I like. I think it's a really good GPP sport. I think you can do quite a bit with the GPPs from the sport. All right. Is there anything else that you sort of think we haven't touched on, Alex, that you want to bring up?
No, I think we hit on it. It's definitely more of a first look show. We'll be monitoring the practice reports, updating projections. By, I would say, tomorrow, we'll have tags and projected ownership up. And the slate kicks off early this week on Friday and runs through Sunday afternoon. So, yeah, nice 3-day main slate, and we'll be on top of all the news and stuff and updating projections as they come out.
For sure. All right, everyone, that's going to wrap it up for us today. For Alex, I'm Sean. Good luck to everyone this weekend. We hope that someone takes down that big GPP. We'll see you guys next week.